Order. Welcome to meeting number 27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is webcast and is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021. Our first hour is in a public session. The second hour will be to consider the two draft reports. So pursuant to in the motion adopted by the committee on March 12th, the committee is resuming a study entitled Canada's International Trade and Investment Policy, Selected Considerations Concerning COVID-19 Vaccines. So with us today, we have Steve Burrell, Chief Trade Negotiator, Assistant Deputy Minister, Trade Policy and Negotiations, and Laura Smirella, Director, Intellectual Property Trade Policy. From the Department of Industry, we have Mark Shawn, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Strategy and Innovation Policy Sector, and Daryl Patterson, Director General Projects and Policy, Biomanufacturing Strategy Implementation Team. And also from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we are expecting Ambassador DeBoer to join us. So we will turn the floor over to Mr.
Just a second, Madam Chair. I think he just arrived in the attendees. I will promote him. Just a sec, please.
Okay, 1 second.
And interpretation.
Welcome, Ambassador DeBoer. Christine here, the clerk. Do you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, could you speak just for 10 seconds?
All right. Thank you very much. Now I'm pleased to be able to invite the Ambassador, His Excellency Stephen DeBoer, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the World Trade Organization from Geneva, Switzerland. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us. I'll turn the floor over to you for opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and my apologies. I did all the right things, and of course, my system crashed. So here we are. So I welcome this opportunity to address this committee. I'm joined today by two Global Affairs Canada officials, Steve Verheuvel, Assistant Deputy Minister for Trade Policy and Negotiations and Chief Trade Negotiator, and Laura Smirella, Director of the Intellectual Property Trade Policy Division. I will first address the discussions at the WTO with respect to global vaccine production and distribution, followed by how Canada's trade agreements may be used to ensure Canada's vaccine advance purchase contracts are respected. Madam Chair, the pandemic continues to affect the world, from the third wave in Canada to the surges we are seeing now in large countries like India and Brazil. As the promise of vaccination offers a light at the end of the tunnel, Canada and the entire international community are looking at ways to better develop, produce, and distribute vaccines. Canada shares our international partners' call for greater international coordination towards ending the pandemic. No one is safe until everyone is safe, which is why Canada strongly supports global solutions towards equitable vaccine distribution. Over the course of the pandemic, Canada has invested and contributed to global programs, namely the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and the COVAX facility, in addition to leading discussions here at the WTO on trade and health, and specifically barriers to vaccine trade. Madam Chair, vaccine production is highly complex and relies heavily on access to raw inputs, as well as the cooperative transfer of know-how, skills, and human expertise from researchers to manufacturers. The distribution of vaccines is also complex due to differing export regimes, regulatory hurdles, highly sophisticated supply chains, and significant logistical and technological requirements to ensure vaccines can get to where they need to be. Canada has engaged actively in WTO discussions on these issues, and we are open to considering all proposals on how best to increase production and equitable distribution of safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines. Our goal and our hope is that interventions are targeted at addressing real bottlenecks and production issues. In these discussions, some are pointing at intellectual property, while others, such as vaccine manufacturers, including those in developing countries, are pointing to an array of trade and supply chain related challenges, like I mentioned before. Madam Chair, as committee members will be aware, in October last year, a group of WTO members led by India and South Africa tabled a proposal for a COVID-19 related waiver from certain sections of the TRIPS agreement. This proposal has since been co-sponsored by a number of developing and least developed members, including the African group. I want to be clear. Canada has never opposed this proposal. In fact, we are continuing to engage with the proponents to identify concrete issues related to or arising from the TRIPS agreement, or that WTO members could not address through the agreement's existing public health flexibilities. For example, late last year, we submitted, along with Australia, Chile, and Mexico, a set of questions aimed at enabling all members to better understand the nature of any barriers experienced in any member's responses to COVID-19 relating to or arising from the TRIPS agreement. However, thus far, the conversation has focused on a number of historical, general, or hypothetical concerns regarding IP. There has been much mention of unused or underused production capacity, but there's not yet been evidence presented of large amounts of COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing capacity that would be unused due to IP issues. Our understanding is that vaccine manufacturers, including those in developing countries, so far do not substantiate this perspective. I'm sure that many find it challenging to reconcile the perspective of proponents that IP is a key challenge and that partnerships are optional, while the vaccine manufacturers that have spoken up have indicated that IP is not a key challenge and that partnerships are essential. Canada continues to encourage the proponents to share information or where any unused or underutilized capacity is located so that we can assess why this is the case. We will continue to engage with WTO members, industry and civil society, stakeholders to better understand the global situation and the challenges to equitable vaccine distribution. Meanwhile, Canada is playing a leadership role in promoting rules-based trade and open supply chains to address COVID-19 related challenges, including at the WTO through the Trade and Health Initiative advanced by Canada and the Ottawa Group. This initiative encourages WTO members to implement trade facilitating measures in the areas of customs, technical regulations and services, exercise restraint in the imposition of export restrictions, temporarily remove or reduce tariffs on essential medical goods, including vaccines and their inputs, and improve transparency of trade measures. Canada also supports the third way approach advanced by the WTO Director General, which is enhancing the WTO's role in global dialogue with the pharmaceutical sector towards accelerating the production and equitable distribution of effective, safe, and affordable COVID-19 vaccines and related medical products. I will now move on to how Canada's trade agreements may be used to ensure Canada's vaccine advance purchase contracts are respected. To recall, on January 29, 2021, the EU brought into force what they referred to as a transparency and authorization mechanism for exports of COVID-19 vaccines. The mechanism was originally set to expire on March 13, but on the same day, the EU extended it until June 30. On April 9, the EU member states added two criteria to the mechanism, namely, first, reciprocity, aimed at vaccine-producing countries, and second, proportionality, based on vaccination rates and the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic in the export country. These two additional criteria will remain in effect until May 6. However, they may also be extended. Since Canada was first notified of the measure on January 29, the Government of Canada has vigorously pursued the EU and its member states at every opportunity to advocate for Canadian interests. While Canada remains concerned with the measure, we continue to receive assurances from the European Commission and EU member states that Canada is not the intended target. In addition, the EU's recent acquisition of 250 million doses from Pfizer for the second quarter of 2021 may decrease the likelihood that the measure will be extended or applied to exports of vaccines destined for Canada. Canadian officials remain in close contact with counterparts in Brussels and Spain to ensure the smooth delivery of vaccines destined for Canada. Both CITA and WTO rules permit export restrictions as long as a restriction is temporary, necessary to prevent or relieve critical shortages, and that the good, vaccines in this case, is deemed essential to the implementing party. However, both CITA and WTO provide mechanisms to support transparency and dialogue on such measures. From the outset, Canada sought to be placed on the list of countries exempted by the EU from the mechanism. The EU did not agree to do so, and in fact, on March 24, removed 17 countries from the exemption list. The EU is a trusted trading partner for Canada, and CITA provides Canada with a direct and well-established channel to continue advocating for Canadian interests with the EU. Canada continues to impress upon the EU that this mechanism must not affect vaccine shipments to Canada, that it runs counter to Canada and the EU's call for global cooperation, and that the EU must fully comply with the transparency undertakings that Canada and the EU are advocating for at the WTO. Thanks in part to this privileged relationship and advocacy efforts, Canada has not been negatively affected by the mechanism, and the EU has streamlined its export process for vaccine shipments to Canada. Nevertheless, Canada has called on the EU to end this measure as soon as possible. Meanwhile, we are actively monitoring and protecting the supply channels for Canada's vaccines from around the world, and will continue to do so with Canadian interests in mind. Madam Chair, this concludes my brief introduction. I would be happy to take any questions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, on to Mr. Abutai, please, for 6 minutes.
Yes, good morning, Madam Chair, to you and to the witnesses. Welcome the Ambassador to our committee today, and to all other witnesses. The question is, I have an article, I think 2-3 days ago, that EU sues AstraZeneca over delays in vaccine deliveries. And that was over the alleged breach of its vaccine contract. So, and the contract, the clause in the contract that appear in Italian magazine RAI include that clause appear to release by the company from legal action for delays on deliveries. So there's a contract between EU and AstraZeneca that was published in a newspaper, and there's a lawsuit against the shortage or breaching of deliveries on the contract. To the Ambassador and to Mr. Verhal, what is the nature of our contract with the vaccine suppliers, since we've been experiencing deliveries, shortages, delays, pushes on deliveries from week to a week to another week, which causing us the third wave. Also is causing us all the lockdowns and the mental health and the hardship that we're going through. So I would be interested to know from the Ambassador or from Mr. Verhoeven, who was involved on negotiating the contract with the suppliers, and what is the content of that, and how protected we are. Either the Ambassador or Mr. Verhoeven.
Well, I have to admit I don't have any details on the contract. That is outside of my ambit. I'm not sure if any of the witnesses do, in fact.
Mr. Verhal.
Yes, I'm in the same position as Mr. DeBoer. I don't have any information on the actual contracts either.
You are a chief trade negotiator, Mr. Verhal, and the ambassador also been talking about the relationships and the assurance that we got from the European Union. But all these verbal assurances, which is the minister says at one point in the committee that she got or she received the verbal assurances about deliveries and that Canada is not targeted by the EU measures. But we have been experiencing that. So what's the action plan? How can we go about that? If we got the wording, we got the verbal assurances. On the other side, we have been experiencing shortage of supply, and no one knows what the contract look like and what can we do to make sure we don't experience these terms or these breaches to our contract that we don't know.
Well, I think the challenge here is really not with the European Union in this case. They have been doing everything we have been asking them to do in terms of ensuring that we would be getting any deliveries that we would be expecting, and we have not had interruptions as a result of that. The difficulties we faced have been more at the company levels and difficulties in production. Some setbacks have occurred. We're now getting lots of vaccines coming from Pfizer. They seem to have resolved most of their production difficulties. Moderna is still experiencing some, but is also coming back on track. So with an operation of this scale, I think we can anticipate that there will be some production hiccups from time to time. That's what we have faced, but we now feel we're very much on track.
I know we don't have the upper hand on the supplies because there's a large demand from everywhere on vaccination. But to the ambassador, are you aware of that WTO have helped the countries placing orders with vaccine suppliers and including some terms that will protect the purchaser as far as the supply chain and as far as getting the product, if not on time, but at least in such an order where you don't have to suffer such big gaps between deliveries?
So there are a number of, I think we need to distinguish between trade policy and contract negotiations in this context. But I would say this: we have been having discussions and trying to remove barriers to the movement of inputs to vaccines and vaccine production, and we have been discussing ways that these things can move much more easily within the global context. And I would also say that the Director General's third way, where she's engaging with industry and with stakeholders, is meant to facilitate these types of discussions to see what can be done to facilitate the movement of vaccines, but also to facilitate the production of vaccines. But the individual contract negotiations itself fall outside of the ambit of the WTO. So in fact, what the DG is engaging in is almost in certain respects an issue of moral suasion to work with industry.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. On to Mr. Raya, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador DeBoer, I'm glad to hear your statement. You know, there's a lot of rumors that Canada is opposing the TRIPS waiver at the WTO. Many people don't realize that Canada is actually working with the TRIPS waiver proponents like South Africa and India, and of course the Africa group, the LDCs, on how best we can address the current situation. Many people think that, oh, if IP is relaxed and is made available, suddenly we'll get the vaccines. But most people don't understand that it's not just the IP. We need other inputs. We need manpower. We need whosoever wants to manufacture, they should have access to the sophisticated supply chain. You know, as you pointed out, discussions on historical, general, hypothetical IP issues is one thing, but to focus on what exactly is required to be done now so that vaccines are made available. Madam Chair, for the people who may not know, the Director General of WTO is advocating the third wave. It means that facilitating technology transfer within the framework of multilateral rules, so as to encourage not just the research and innovation, but at the same time allowing licensing arrangements that help scale up manufacturing of medical products. So, Ambassador Debo, let me start with a very simple question. Can you reconfirm that Canada is not opposing per se the TRIPS waiver? Is that accurate?
That is absolutely accurate. We have not opposed the decision on the waiver, and we're looking and we welcome a full assessment of the specific challenges that are being faced by WTO members. It's one of the reasons why we, along with, as I indicated earlier, along with Australia and Mexico, posed questions to the TRIPS Council so we could further examine how the waiver might operate, what the problems were that were being faced by in the production of vaccines. But I would point out that the WTO has not reached any decision stage on the waiver itself. So we continue to engage with WTO members, including the proponents of the TRIPS waiver on this issue.
Thank you. See, that is the thing, Madam Chair. Many a times people think that, one simple solution, waive the IP rights and everything will be smooth and suddenly the vaccines becomes available. That is not the thing. We have to understand all the issues that, we should not lead to some unintended consequences in the medium to long-term range. In addition to IP, we should know what is the manufacturing capacity that is available today that is being not used. It is not being used for due to IP issues. The partnership in products like this vaccines, which has got a lot of science behind it, the partnership is probably much more important than the IP itself. Ambassador, can you tell me on this unused manufacturing capacity? It's been almost bandied around. There's a lot of unused manufacturing capacity in developing countries that could be manufacturing COVID vaccines. And while that, we have to recognize that not all developing countries have got any manufacturing capacity. But can you just highlight on the issue of there is any unused manufacturing capacity?
So what we're hearing, and when we talk to industry, including as part of the Director General's third way process, that there is some unused manufacturing capacity, but not large quantities. And we have not been able to identify large quantities of production capacities. So, but we would also say, and what we're learning as well is that even if there was large unused production capacity, it's not as if this production capacity can be used overnight to increase vaccine production, nor is it clear to us at this point, and we continue to ask the questions and examine this issue, how the suspension of IP rights or a waiver of TRIPS would actually unlock this unused production capacity. So this is a difficult issue for us to get our heads around, but we're not hearing about large scale production capacity issues. The constraint is not, I should also say, when we have been talking to industry stakeholders, the constraint does not seem to be IP, but the complexities associated with technology transfer. As you point out, the IP is one issue, but it's the transfer of the know-how. It's not as simple as simply creating a recipe and saying, here is the recipe. So it's this notion of unused production capacity is not just related to a facility, but also to having the technological know-how to receive the information which would result in production or increased production.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Bonjour, salutations.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the witnesses for your presentation. I'd like to ask the representative of GAC. Well, perhaps, first of all, let me give you some background. The Quebec Minister of Finance has said we lived with masks. A shortage occurred at the beginning. We were dependent on international sources, and this has had a large impact on Canada. Now, in regards to vaccines, what's the attitude of government as to the access to these vaccines and that they should be reserved for us specifically?
En fait,
It was addressed to the representatives of the Foreign Affairs Department. You can undoubtedly answer if you wish.
We may also want to bring in our colleagues from CIIT for some of these questions, because this really isn't within the mandate of what we do at Global Affairs in terms of our efforts on trade negotiations and those kinds of issues and trade agreements. Vaccines were negotiated through domestic policies and domestic provisions, so we were not involved in any of those efforts. Same with PPE. We certainly were in contact with foreign suppliers to some degree, but this was not something that we were responsible for.
J'en ai justement eu.
Well, I do have a question for CIIT representatives. The pharmaceutical environment over the last 5 years have had not been faced with any particular policies. We've heard from various witnesses saying there was a bit of almost an indifference from the participants in the pharmaceutical sector. Now, what happened in the previous 5 years didn't reflect any kind of cooperation or going forward between these. Should we not have been acting much more before this crisis occurred?
Et je le reprécise, cette question était pour les.
This for CIIT representatives, please.
Peut-être bien pour mon collègue Daryl de offre les commentaires.
Well, perhaps my colleague Daryl can add to this, but from my perspective, this area is absolutely essential for Canada's economy, and the development of the pharmaceutical sector is vital for Canadian society as well, for their well-being and health, and to ensure, of course, continued economic growth post-pandemic. These initiatives in research and innovation in the health and life sector in Canada are very important, and they continue to be supported. But perhaps Daryl, my colleague, will be able to share with you some recent developments in this area. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the question.
I'd say, it's widely recognized that the biomanufacturing industry in Canada over a number of decades has diminished. And at the outset of the pandemic, there was a realization that Canada did lack a large population scale end-to-end capacity to manufacture COVID vaccines. And so the government immediately took steps to implement a strategy to build up biomanufacturing capacity in Canada and work with the companies in Canada and abroad to attract rapid scale up of biomanufacturing capacity. But as my colleagues have already pointed out, that takes a bit of time. And so relying on the expert advice of the task force, Canada has implemented a strategy that's three-pronged, immediately mobilizing and expanding existing capacity, working with international partners to attract vaccine development here over the long term, and building out the ecosystem. So we talked about the supply chain as well, and making sure that we have the talent and the researchers and the supply chain inputs in Canada to the extent that we can become globally integrated into the process. And so a number of investments have taken place over the past year, including investments in the NRC and companies throughout Canada, Medicago, Accelera, Precision Nanosystems, as well as contract manufacturers, including CABS in Quebec and Novacol in Ontario. And so the government is now keenly focused on moving forward, working cooperatively with the industry, with research institutes, with the labor force to make sure that Canada is well positioned moving forward and is ready to engage with the industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patterson. On to Mr. Blakey, please.
Thank you very much. We've heard a number of times that Canada doesn't actively oppose the TRIPS waiver. Perhaps somebody could just explain the process at the WTO. Does the application for a waiver or the proposal for a waiver automatically pass if nobody opposes it, or does it require active support at the WTO in order for it to pass?
Well, decision making at the WTO is normally done by consensus. So a proposal would have to get the support of the entire membership. So you don't have to actively be against a particular proposal, but you do need to support proposals. And so the discussions that have been happening at the TRIPS Council around the waiver have been around this notion of building support for the waiver itself, which is why there have been these discussions and the reports to the General Counsel and continuing discussions, including with countries like Canada, as we're trying to explore how the waiver might work, what some of the barriers are to vaccine production, and further examination, including talking to industry participating in the Director General's third way. So going forward, we would need consensus.
So I'm just trying to understand, like, is it the position of the government that Canada's support or not of the waiver proposal wouldn't make a difference either way? I mean, usually when things are proposed, you need supporters in order to get it through. I find Canada's position, somewhat odd, to put it really mildly. One's tempted to call it somewhat disingenuous, because the question is whether the status quo obtains with respect to intellectual property or not, because we're in an exceptional position and we recognize that, waiving the typical kinds of intellectual property protections would be have a salutary effect on vaccine production globally. So, does Canada support the status quo, or does it support the waiver?
I don't think it's that straightforward. We don't know at this point whether there's a clear line between lifting of patent protection and the waiver itself and an increase in vaccine production. What is being asked is for the rules to be suspended, which is a serious question. Canada is a huge proponent of a rules-based regime, and so
with respect, it's a serious pandemic. I mean,
absolutely.
So I don't think anybody who's proposing the waiver is doing so lightly, or because they don't think that there's significant exceptional circumstances that warrant the waiver. So yes, it is an exceptional measure, these are exceptional times. I don't think that's really an adequate answer. I mean, certainly one thing that we haven't heard is that the waiver at the WTO would reduce global vaccine supply. We've heard that some people, once they have the intellectual property rights, who think that they may be able to produce more vaccine, may in fact find that there are more complicating factors that they hadn't considered, or that they don't have access to other things that are important. And so that means that they may fail to produce more vaccine. But isn't it better in this context that we have as many people trying to produce vaccine as possible, and that we take as many barriers to vaccine production off the table? And again, I mean, I don't hear anybody saying that granting the IP waiver or the waiver of the TRIPS provisions at the WTO risks reducing global vaccine supply.
Well, this is a question that's being asked, and we don't know that for a fact. What we do know is that the creation of these vaccines, what has been very important in the creation of the vaccines is the collaborative partnerships in scaling up production and technology transfer. What is a concern to some members is what a waiver might do to those collaborative relationships, and whether it would actually be detrimental to vaccine production if you interfered with those partnerships between the originators and the manufacturers. So that is not, it's not a given that the waiver is something that's worth trying because there are no negative consequences to the waiver. I'm not saying that there are negative consequences. What I am saying is we don't know. And there is a risk.
One of the things that I find curious, like I'm interested to
Very
know,
short, Mr. Blakey,
or understand a little better the kinds of information you're asking for. Like presumably you're asking for information from potential manufacturers about what their problems are. So that could be supply chain problems, it could be technology transfer problems, those kinds of things. Are those details that the major vaccine manufacturers of the day, like Pfizer and Moderna, have disclosed publicly? And why would we expect that other players would do so as a condition of getting
Thank you, Mr.
access
Blakey.
to intellectual property?
Could we get a brief answer, Ambassador?
So our conversations are both with developed country and developing country manufacturers, and they've pointed to a series of problems and barriers. Intellectual property is not the one that we're hearing about. It's more around issues like export restrictions, access to inputs, having the technological know-how at the other end to actually assist in the manufacturing of the vaccines. This is what we are hearing at this point.
Thank you, Ambassador. On to Ms. Gray for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. Ambassador, you stated in your testimony today that Canada sought to be on the EU vaccine export exemption list, and the EU said no. When did we ask, and when did we have that answer of no? To you, Ambassador.
I am not sure I am the right person to be answering that question, and I'm looking to see, because I don't have the exact date.
Okay. This information that you gave us today is the first time that we've heard that information, that Canada actually asked to be on the list and were informed no. So maybe someone else, maybe Mr. Verhul, do you have that information?
I'm afraid I don't have a specific date either. We did make the request on a number of occasions at a number of different levels for the EU to put us on the list of exempted countries. They did not do that. They didn't make any changes to that list until quite a bit later on, and then they withdrew a number of countries from the exempted list, so they narrowed it down considerably. One of the reasons we raised that issue was because we did have concerns that if the EU was exempting certain countries but not others, then that would put them in a position where their measure could be offside their WTO commitments. And so we did express concerns about that.
Okay, well, I would like to ask to have it tabled. Who asked for the exemption? When we heard back, how we heard back, who was asking, how many times we asked, and what the correspondence back was. Is that something that would be able to be tabled to this committee?
I'm sure we could provide that information, yes.
Great, thank you very much. It's all very, very interesting to hear this all for the first time. Ambassador, you also said that Canada was not intended as a target for the vaccine exemptions from the EU, which doesn't sound very reassuring. So would you say the EU has measures that would be different? Like what, saying that we're not intended is not the same as saying we will not be affected. So wouldn't you say that that's very different? That we would not be affected as opposed to we're not, intended to be affected? Ambassador?
Yes, sorry, I was looking for my mute and unmute button. Yes, I do think that they are different, and I do think it was unfortunate. But I would also note that there has been no negative consequences with respect to the movement of vaccines to Canada, despite the EU measures.
So can you table with this committee any correspondence or documents from anyone in the European Union confirming that Canada will not be affected by the EU export control measures for COVID-19 vaccines? Can someone respond to that?
We can certainly look at what we have. We were assured that we would not be affected by a number of our interlocutors on a number of occasions, and I'm certain we can provide that information.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I've had a number of delays in response. I don't know if they're technological or not sure with the witnesses knowing who's speaking. I'm wondering if I can have a little bit of time.
You've got 45 seconds remaining. We'll give you that extra 15 seconds for the delay in communication, but we want to make sure that the others get a chance to ask the questions, and we only have 15 minutes. Well, actually, we have 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to acknowledge as well that we did start late as well due to technical problems. Can someone please table any analysis done on the two new additions from the EU export controls, how this could affect Canada specifically on the reciprocity and proportionality restrictions? What analysis was done on that and how that might affect Canada?
We can certainly take a look at that. We did talk to the EU at length about those particular conditions. We never saw them as a particular concern from our perspective, and we were assured from the EU side that they would not be a concern.
You're saying we didn't do any analysis at all on that?
No, I did not say that. We did do analysis on that.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Bendayan, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would also like to thank the witnesses appearing before our committee today. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for all of your work at the WTO on behalf of Canada and particularly our Canadian businesses and exporters. I do have a couple of questions for you arising out of our TRIP study, but I see that many colleagues are talking about vaccines for Canadians today, and I just wanted also to make sure it was on the record, even though there's much discussion about Europe, we will be receiving Pfizer vaccines from the United States beginning next week. For the European export restrictions that were being discussed just a moment ago, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Verhul, my understanding is that the only countries left on the exemption list for these EU measures are low-income countries. Is that your understanding as well? Mr. Verhul, perhaps?
Yes, that is our understanding.
Thank you. And Mr. Ambassador, with respect to the TRIPS discussions that are ongoing at the WTO, I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on what you are hearing from both waiver proponents and industry. We in this committee have heard testimony from various Canadian industries and research organizations, pharmaceutical companies, as well as several experts indicating that there may be a risk to our own Canadian biomanufacturing industry just by virtue of the fact that we would be introducing uncertainty into what is otherwise a very well-known playing field. Mr. Ambassador, in your view, is that a risk that this committee should be concerned about?
Well, thank you for the question. It certainly is consistent with what I alluded to or what I had stated before. At this point, we don't know, but we have had the position, consistent position that rules are there for a reason, and not their suspension should not be taken lightly. So it does not surprise us to hear that there may be some discomfort and some hesitancy around the waiver for that very reason. And that's something that's worth, in our view, worth exploring to ensure that there aren't negative consequences to the imposition or to the creation of the waiver.
Thank you. And you insisted a lot in your earlier testimony on the importance of the technology transfer as being an essential ingredient in order to have more equitable global access to vaccines. Is there anything in the current mutation of what the waiver proponents are asking for that would allow or require that technology transfer, or what we're talking about exclusively the waiver of intellectual property rights?
It's actually fairly difficult to comment on the waiver because we haven't seen a revised text, and so we're not sure. But at this point, it would appear to be limited to intellectual property, although the broad gamut of intellectual property, including trademark, copyright, and patents. But we don't actually. There isn't anything that speaks to that necessarily.
And picking up on that exact point, do you feel therefore that it is fair for Canada to wait in order to see the full text of what is being proposed before taking an official position?
Well, absolutely. I think that would be. I don't think it would be wise to make policies in any other way.
And so, to your advice to this committee, I guess, stemming from that is to be judicious, I guess, in our evaluation of this study.
Yes, look, there is a significant problem. This is a pandemic. Another one of the members reminded me of that. This is a serious problem, and it requires a serious evaluation. But we need to make sure that we're doing that evaluation and we're leaving no stone unturned. So absolutely, that is our role, to be examining this very closely and with an open mind. We have not said no to the waiver, but we certainly do have questions with respect to the waiver.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, rebonjour.
Good afternoon. I'm still talking to our friends from industry. Thank you once again for being here. When this pandemic started in March 2020, how come there was no consultation, there was no meeting with scientific stakeholders in Quebec and Canada for us to be able to try to produce a vaccine? When we look at what happened in France, the president launched a solemn call mobilizing industry. There were meetings with industry members working on a COVID vaccine. Why did we wait for August 2021 to announce investments in this domain, biomanufacturing?
Peut-être je commence encore et...
Let me start, and then I'll give the floor to my colleague, Daryl. Let me just say that there was a call for action to the entire industry to unite forces to fight against the pandemic at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Was launched early in the pandemic to bring together all of the industrial capacities in the manufacture of a number of different elements to be able to aid in the COVID effort, including in PPE and in other innovations, in digital and technological innovations. And that also then saw the efforts to be able to ensure that we had appropriate mechanisms to assess those. With respect to the specifics on biomanufacturing, I would pass the mic over to my colleague Daryl.
Merci, Marc. So investments were immediately made in a number of companies in March and April, including Medicago and Accelera. And I believe, Marc, the call out April 25th, 2020 was when there was a call out for applications for vaccine, therapeutics, as well as biomanufacturing projects that went to the Strategic Innovation Fund. And 90 proposals, I believe, around 90 were received, 21 of which were biomanufacturing proposals. Those proposals were evaluated rigorously with expert advice and then funded as soon as possible thereafter for those that were deemed to be promising and successful. And those investments continue today and will continue into the future as the government looks towards the long-term pandemic preparedness and biomanufacturing strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. On to Mr. Blakey for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just, I know I don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to canvass the committee on whether we might be able to have these witnesses back. I know we, often have officials appear for 2 hours. It was already a briefer appearance than normal, and then of course some technical difficulties ate into the time we had today. So don't know that we need to decide that immediately, but I wanted to put a marker down that I think that's a question the committee ought to return to, and hopefully our witnesses would be prepared to accommodate that if it is the will of the committee. And
yes.
I just
Go ahead, Mr. Blakey. We will raise that issue before we go into the dealing with the report after. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I mean, I guess my question here is that I know that the ambassador has said that they're not hearing that the principal issue is intellectual property, but we're certainly hearing from some folks, if no one else, the proponents of the waiver, that intellectual property is an issue. We also know that time is an issue, and it's already, Canada has not supported this waiver from the outset. It's been before the WTO since going back at least to October. If granting some exceptions on IP is going to make a difference, surely it has the biggest potential to make a positive difference the earlier that it's granted. So I mean, at what point does Canada recognize that its failure to advocate for this rags the puck to the point that whatever difference it might have been able to make is going to be far less than if Canada had joined others in proactively supporting the waiver earlier on?
A brief answer. Mr. Verrill, Ambassador, whichever one wants to answer that or make comment, please.
Well, I think it's very important to recognize that this is a consensus-based organization with 164 members. Canada has not said no to the waiver, but if Canada did say, but Canada has to be joined by 163 other members. It's not for Canada to decide. Canada can certainly show leadership. Canada can certainly advocate on one side or the other. What Canada is advocating for now is a better understanding of the waiver, engaging with the proponents, engaging with industry, both in the developed and the developing world, to find out if this is actually the correct approach. But Canada does not have a veto in this context, but Canada can certainly work towards achieving a result.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. To the members of the committee, there are 2 more members in order to complete round 2. Now, we've had some technical difficulties. Mr. Blakey's interested in possibly coming back with these witnesses. We are scheduled to go in camera to deal with the very report that some of our witnesses are referring to. So I have Mr. Hoback and then Mr. Dhaliwal to complete this round. Does the committee want to go forward and have those, give the witnesses 5 minutes each?
I'm okay, Judy, right now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. Mr. Hoback, do you have a pressing question there?
Yeah, I definitely do have some questions here. I'm a little frustrated.
Okay, then
are you okay
Mr.
with that,
Hoback,
okay.
we'll adjust. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Hoback, for 5 minutes.
And thank you, Chair. I guess Ms. Ben-Diane kind of touched on this a little bit, and I just want to relate that. When we make decisions internationally, we don't want to make a decision that would prevent something domestically happening. So, Ambassador, when you were talking about the TRIPS agreement, if we were to get out in front and endorse it, would that destabilize things to such a factor that we would possibly see some potential manufacturing be put on hold or not happen here in Canada? I don't know the answer to that. I certainly think that that's a factor in the consideration as to what that means in terms of international reputation, but I don't think that we know enough about how the waiver would actually operate to be able to give you a definitive answer. But absolutely, when we think about the waiver, we think of it there are 3 lanes, I suppose, that it will be very positive for vaccine production, that it'll be neutral, or that it would have a negative consequence. And what you are talking about is one of the potential negative consequences to granting the waiver. Okay, and then we've heard from witnesses before that this is not a simple vaccine. There's a fair amount of not just intellectual property, not just ingredients, but processes involved. And there's severe concern about if they're not done properly, we'd actually end up with product that would be harmful, not beneficial. So as we look at what we can do to help other countries, as we look at our innovation and bring vaccines here into Canada, are we also taking consideration not only Canadians, but what Canada can do outside of Canada, what we do in Central America, South America, so that we have the know-how, the technology, and the abilities to not only produce Canadians, but actually share or be involved with other parts that are in our own hemisphere? Maybe that should go to Mr. Patterson.
Mr. Patterson?
Yeah, no. So I think the primary focus of our strategy implementation team is to ramp up capacity in Canada, and you're right that the manufacturing process is complex and it varies based on vaccine type, and we're trying to build up capacities to not only support the Canadian population, but eventually become a global player that can support and partner with other countries as we build out our strategy. But we're starting from a place where the capacity is lacking in Canada, and so the first step is to make the investments to build up the industry to be able to support moving forward.
Okay, and as you do that, again, you need to have some sort of vision of what you want to get to, and that's why I look at the international consequences. We had a witness in here 2 weeks ago on Friday, actually a week ago last Friday, saying that unless we start vaccinating around the globe, instead we start seeing that level of vaccination hit in other countries, it doesn't matter what we do in Canada, we'll still be at threat to variants because other parts of the world will see the virus mutate, and as they travel into Canada, or Canadians travel there. So either we're going to have severe travel restrictions into countries that we can or can't travel, or we do a better job, not just vaccinating Canadians, but we look at this in a global nature and say, hey, we can't do it all, but maybe we take a certain area, like I say, Central and South America, Caribbean, and say, hey, this is our backyard. We're going to make sure we've got enough capacity to do that as well. So is that in your vision when you look at developing this sector here into Canada?
So I think, I mean, industry's mandate, innovation, science, and economic development's mandate is to attract investment in Canada and to build up the biomanufacturing sector. And to do that, we need to work with all partners, international, provincial, territorial, industry, academic, and so we're doing that in terms of supporting the construction of facilities or the building up of biomanufacturing capacity outside of the country. I think that would be something we would do in partnership with others, as opposed to immediate efforts that we're trying to do in Canada, which is investing in Canadian companies.
Yeah, I'm not saying build outside of Canada. I'm saying build it in Canada, but have the capacity in Canada for not just Canada, but for other parts of the world. And have, I guess going back to global affairs, have those discussions gone on with other countries in regards to how we're going to handle areas that just don't have the capabilities of doing this type of vaccine, yet we do. So are those considerations in our international discussions at this point in time, Ambassador? Are we saying, you know what, we need to make sure that we've got XYZ available, not just for Canada, not just for the rich countries, but for everybody else? Because it looks like the TRIPS isn't going to be a possibility. If you need consensus, we don't have to say anything. We just have to listen to somebody else say no and just go, okay, we didn't have to take a statement. And this government's very good at doing that, of not making a statement. So it doesn't solve the problem. And the problem is we have to get more people vaccinated. So how do we do that?
Thank you, Mr. Hoback. If the Ambassador, Mr. Verreau, wants to give a brief answer, please.
Well, I would just note Canada's support for things like COVAX, for example, and the financial support we're putting into vaccine development for sharing in the developing world. So
we're not sharing COVAX.
Okay, please let the Ambassador respond.
Well, we've made a significant financial contribution to that facility. The other thing I would say is that Canada has been leading with the Ottawa Group on trade and health. This is something that the Director General is very interested in pursuing as well. These are the other aspects of access to vaccines and access to PPEs and therapeutics that the proponents aren't necessarily talking about, but we know that there are barriers to trade in these goods, and they are important in the context of the pandemic and addressing the pandemic. And so there is scope for work in other areas of the WTO. The WTO is not just TRIPS. It's about all kinds of other things, including customs procedures, rules around export restrictions, technical barriers to trade. There's a lot of work that can be done to get out of the way of the free movement of inputs to vaccines and the vaccines themselves.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Dhaliwal, please.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'll share my time with Mr. Srai, my next door neighbor and my younger brother. His Excellency, Ambassador, you talked about production and equitable distribution. Now, it's my understanding that Canada is actively working with international partners to support the WTO Director General's third way approach. Could you please tell us more about Canada's advocacy in enhancing the WTO's role in global dialogue with the pharmaceutical sector to accelerate equitable global vaccine production and distribution?
So let me say at the outset that what the Director General is doing is quite novel from a WTO perspective. She's actually stepping a little bit out of what is seen as the traditional role of the Director General of the World Trade Organization. So the first thing that Canada did when she announced that she wanted to do this and have discussions with industry and with stakeholders and with international financial institutions was to issue a communication to the General Counsel along with some other countries to support her in this, to give her some policy cover for her to take these discussions forward. She's had 2 series of discussions, and Canada participated in the second set, where there was a series of interactions with developed and developing country vaccine producers, and also with the IFIs and with some politicians from the United States, from the EU, and others. So it was meant to facilitate this dialogue, and Canada is actively promoting this dialogue to examine what the problems are and to move as quickly as possible on vaccines.
Madam Chair, I'll give it to Mr. Srai, and then I will come back if I have time.
Mr. Sarai, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My simple question, I spoke with, and I'm sure other members might have had a call from Dr. Christian Bergsmuller, the deputy head of the mission. Madam Chair, I think you're
Sorry.
off mute. No worries. I had spoken to them and asked them questions in regards to the vaccination. And my understanding in terms of the exemptions, there were 620 requested globally from the European Union for vaccinations. And apparently everyone was approved except for one. Is that what your understanding is as well, Mr. Boer, Your Excellency?
That is my understanding as well.
And my understanding by my conversation with them that their intention was not to block, but to make sure that when production delays were occurring at the vaccination sites, that a similar amount of reduction was done for global exports as it would have been done for their domestic European Union supplies, so that the European Union was not unfairly prejudiced by contracts abroad. And that was their intention, not to actually physically block out other countries. In fact, the one that was refused was actually a European distributor that was refused, not anybody internationally that had commitments signed. Is that what you heard as well, Your Excellency?
That is what I heard, but I want to underscore for you that I am not privy to all of those conversations. So I have heard the same, but I don't know for a fact that that's actually what happened.
And lastly, quickly, my understanding from this TRIPS, from all the testimony we've heard, that regardless of whether a TRIPS waiver occurs or not, the actual ability to make a vaccine is a lot more complicated than just releasing patents and allowing countries to make it. It requires a lot of ingredients, facilities, faculties. So is understanding when you speak to your counterparts that making the vaccine more available through agreements like the ones we've had before to low income or third world countries and that need it, a better source of our attention, rather than kind of pondering this only as time flies by, even if it was to be done to actually organize and build a capacity, would be very difficult for some of those marginalized countries.
Yeah, there is a sense amongst some that it is simply a question of a recipe, and we know that not to be the case. These are biologics; they're highly complex. They have over 200 ingredients. There's a technical expertise that's required in their manufacturing, and so this is one of the issues that we have when we think about the waiver. You cannot reverse engineer a biologic. You can't simply take the vaccine and say, well, I know how this was made, and then replicate that easily. In fact, it would be next to impossible. But it is absolutely true, as you point out, that there is a serious problem around the production of vaccines. We need an enormous number of vaccines, and we have to ramp up the production as quickly as possible. It's not clear that the waiver is the way that will be done. But I say not clear. We do not have an opinion necessarily, but we're examining that.
Thank you. That's all, Madam Chair.
Right. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and to our witnesses. We very much appreciate the valuable information today. So I will excuse our witnesses. To our members, we all need to close down from, so we need to leave our site that we're on and then come back in with a different password and virtual site. So everybody please exit and enter as quickly as we can. Thank you.